Welcome to Mystery at 221B, where Sherlock Holmes' secrets come to life.
Sherlock Holmes and the Phantom Carriage is a classic mystery set in the fog-drenched Blackthorn Hall, a grand Sussex estate haunted by tales of a spectral carriage. When solicitor Victor Crane is found murdered in the library, stabbed with a letter opener, Captain Arthur Hastings summons Sherlock Holmes to untangle a web of deception. The close-circle mystery unfolds among a cast of suspects. Colonel Ashford, the debt-ridden patriarch; Clara, his secretive niece; Julian Marlowe, a volatile heir; Lady Beatrice Marlowe, his imperious mother; and Dr. Lionel Grayson, a nervous physician. Each harbors motives tied to a contested will that threatens the estate's future. Chapter 1. The Shadow of Blackthorn Hall. In the waning days of October, when the mists clung low to the Sussex downs and the air carried the crisp promise of winter, Captain Arthur Hastings found himself summoned to a place as remote as it was grand. Blackthorn Hall. The estate, nestled in a hollow of ancient oaks and yew trees, stood like a relic of a bygone era, its grey stone facade looming against the twilight. Hastings, ever the loyal companion to the inimitable Sherlock Holmes, had received a letter from an old acquaintance, Colonel Reginald Ashford, imploring his presence to advise on a matter of delicate and pressing concern. The tone of the missive, penned in a hurried hand, hinted at something more sinister than a mere social call. The journey from London had been tedious, the train rattling through fog-choked valleys until it deposited Hastings at the small station of Thornwick. From there, a hired carriage bore him along winding lanes, the driver silent save for the occasional mutter about the queer goings-on at the hall. As the carriage crested a hill, Blackthorn Hall emerged from the mist, its windows glowing faintly like the eyes of a watchful beast. Hastings adjusted his scarf against the chill and stepped down, his boots crunching on the gravel drive. The great oak door swung open before he could knock, revealing a butler whose pallor matched the moonlight. "Captain Hastings, I presume?" the butler intoned, his voice as hollow as the corridors behind him. "The colonel awaits you in the drawing room." Hastings followed, noting the grandeur of the entrance hall, a chandelier of blackened iron, portraits of stern-faced Ashfords glaring from the walls, and a grand staircase spiraling into shadow. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and wax polish, undercut by something sharper. Fear, perhaps, or secrecy. The butler led him to a drawing room, where a fire crackled fitfully, casting long shadows across a gathering of figures who turned as one to regard the newcomer. Colonel Reginald Ashford, a man of 60 with a soldier's bearing and a face etched with worry, rose to greet him. "Hastings, my dear fellow, thank you for coming on such short notice." His handshake was firm but betrayed a tremor. "We are in dire need of clarity, and I could think of no one better suited than your friend, Monsieur Sherlock Holmes. Is he to join us?" "He will arrive tomorrow," Hastings replied, settling into a high-backed chair. "I've come ahead to assess the situation. Your letter was vague, Colonel. What precisely is the trouble?" The room's occupants, an eclectic assembly of family and guests, exchanged glances. There was Miss Clara Ashford, the colonel's niece, a pale young woman of 25, whose delicate features belied a sharp, watchful gaze. Beside her sat Dr. Lionel Grayson, a physician with a nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles. Across the room, Lady Beatrice Marlowe, a widow of striking beauty and imperious demeanor, sipped sherry with studied indifference. Her son, Julian Marlowe, a lean youth with a restless energy, paced near the window. Finally, there was Mr. Victor Crane, a solicitor from London, whose pinched expression suggested he found the countryside profoundly disagreeable. The colonel cleared his throat. "It began 3 nights ago," he said, his voice low. "A disturbance in the grounds. A carriage, or so it seemed, was heard racing along the drive at midnight. The horses' hooves, the creak of wheels, it was unmistakable. Yet when my groundskeeper investigated, there was nothing. No tracks, no carriage, no sign of intrusion. The next night, it happened again, louder, closer. "And last night," he faltered, his eyes darting to the window. "Last night," Clara interjected, her voice steady but tight. "We saw it. A black carriage, drawn by 2 horses, passed the east wing. It moved without sound, yet the windows rattled as it went. And then, gone, vanished into the mist." "Nonsense," snapped Victor Crane, his thin lips curling. "A trick of the light, or some prankster from the village. You're all letting your imaginations run wild." "Imagination does not break glass," Lady Beatrice countered coolly, gesturing to a sideboard where a shattered decanter lay in pieces. "Nor does it leave this." She produced a small object from her reticule and placed it on the table. A brass button, engraved with a curious symbol, a crescent moon entwined with a thorn. Hastings examined it, his pulse quickening. "This was found after the carriage passed." "By the stables," the colonel confirmed. "And there's more. My groundskeeper, old Tom, swears he saw a figure in the fog, a man in a cloak, standing where the carriage vanished. Tom's not one for fancies, but he's been shaken ever since." Dr. Grayson leaned forward, his spectacles glinting. "I examined Tom this morning. His nerves are frayed, but he's otherwise sound. I'd wager he saw something real, though what I cannot say." Julian Marlowe stopped pacing, his hands thrust into his pockets. "It's a warning," he said darkly. "This place is cursed. Always has been."
Stories.
Hastings observed the group, noting the undercurrents of tension. Clara's fingers twisted a handkerchief, Grayson's eyes darted nervously, and Crane's sneer barely masked unease. The colonel, for all his military composure, seemed on the verge of collapse. Lady Beatrice alone appeared unruffled, though her grip on her glass was tight. "May I see the grounds?" Hastings asked, "and perhaps speak with this groundskeeper?" "Of course," the colonel said, rising, "but be warned, the fog is thick tonight. It's no night for wandering." As they stepped into the chill evening air, Hastings felt the weight of unseen eyes. The fog swirled, obscuring the lawns, and the distant hoot of an owl seemed to carry a note of warning. Old Tom, a wiry man with a face like weathered oak, met them by the stables. His account was terse but vivid. The carriage, the cloaked figure, the button found in the dew-soaked grass. He pointed to the spot where the apparition had vanished, a patch of ground near an ancient yew tree, unmarred by hoofprints or wheel ruts. Hastings knelt, his fingers brushing the earth. "No tracks at all?" he asked. "None, sir," Tom replied. "It's as if the devil himself drove that carriage." Returning to the hall, Hastings mulled over the details. A phantom carriage, a mysterious button, a figure in the fog. These were the threads of a puzzle that Sherlock Holmes would relish. As he rejoined the group, he noted the time, 9:47 p.m., according to the mantel clock. The fire had died to embers, and the room felt colder than before. "Colonel," Hastings said, "I suggest we secure the house tonight. Windows locked, doors bolted. If this is a prank, we'll catch the culprit. If it's something else—" He left the thought unfinished. The colonel nodded, issuing orders to the butler. Clara offered a faint smile, as if grateful for any action, while Julian muttered something inaudible and resumed pacing. Lady Beatrice retired early, claiming a headache, and Crane excused himself to review papers. Dr. Grayson lingered, offering to assist with securing the house, though his hands trembled as he spoke. As Hastings retired to his room, he penned a quick note to Sherlock Holmes, detailing the evening's events, the button, the carriage, the fog. It was a case that demanded the little gray cells. He sealed the letter and placed it on the bedside table, unaware that the night's true horror was yet to unfold. Beyond the window, the fog thickened, and a faint sound, like the distant clatter of hooves, echoed in the darkness. Chapter 2. The Cry in the Night. The night at Blackthorn Hall was restless, the kind of night where shadows seemed to shift of their own accord, and every creak of the ancient house carried a whisper of menace. Captain Arthur Hastings, lying in the cryptic symbol, the palpable tension among the household, gnawed at his mind. He had secured his window and checked the lock in his door, but the oppressive silence of the hall felt like a prelude to something dire. At precisely 2:13 a.m., as recorded by the small travel clock on his bedside table, a scream shattered the stillness. It was a piercing, anguished cry, unmistakably human, and it came from somewhere within the house. Hastings bolted upright, his heart pounding, and fumbled for the candle by his bed. Lighting it with unsteady hands, he pulled on his dressing gown and stepped into the corridor, where the air was thick with the chill of pre-dawn. The hallway was dark, save for the faint glow of a single wall sconce. Other doors were opening, and voices, some alarmed, others querulous, began to fill the space. Colonel Ashford appeared, his nightshirt hastily tucked into trousers, a revolver in his hand. "Hastings, did you hear it?" he demanded, his eyes wild. "I did," Hastings replied, striving for calm. "Where did it come from?" "Downstairs, I think," said Clara Ashford, emerging from her room in a white nightgown, her face pale but composed. "The East Wing, perhaps." Dr. Lionel Grayson joined them, his spectacles askew and a medical bag clutched tightly. "We must investigate at once," he said, though his voice trembled. It sounded like someone in mortal peril. The group, now joined by a disheveled Julian Marlowe and a grim-faced butler, descended the grand staircase. Lady Beatrice Marlowe and Victor Crane were conspicuously absent. The scream had not repeated, but its echo seemed to linger in the cavernous halls. They moved toward the east wing, where the drawing room and library lay, the candlelight casting grotesque shadows on the panelled walls. In the library, they found the source of the disturbance. Victor Crane, the solicitor, lay sprawled across the floor, his body twisted unnaturally. A pool of blood spread from beneath his head, staining the Persian rug. His eyes were wide open, fixed in a stare of terror, and a letter opener, its silver handle gleaming in the candlelight, protruded from his chest. The window behind him was ajar, letting in a draught that made the curtains flutter like ghosts. "Good God," the colonel whispered, his revolver lowering. "He's dead." Dr. Grayson knelt beside the body, his fingers probing for a pulse. "Stabbed through the heart," he said after a moment. "Death was likely instantaneous. This happened within the last hour." Hastings, his mind racing, took in the scene. The library was a grand room, lined with bookshelves and dominated by a mahogany desk. Papers were scattered across the desk, some blood-spattered, and a single sheet lay crumpled near Crane's hand. Hastings picked it up with care, noting its contents, a draft of a will, with the colonel's name prominent and several clauses heavily underlined. He tucked it into his pocket for later scrutiny. "Was anyone else in this part of the house?" Hastings asked, turning to the group. "I was in my room," Clara said quickly. "I couldn't sleep after all the talk of that carriage. I heard nothing until the scream." "As did I," said Julian, though his eyes avoided Hastings. "I was reading." The colonel shook his head. "I was asleep until the noise woke me. The servants' quarters are too far to hear anything clearly." Grayson adjusted his spectacles, his face ashen. "I was in the West Wing, checking on some medicines in my room. I heard no footsteps, no struggle." Hastings noted the alibis, each delivered with varying degrees of conviction. He moved to the window, examining the latch. It was old but intact, with no signs of forced entry. Outside, the fog was impenetrable, swallowing the grounds in a gray shroud. He turned back to the room, his gaze falling on a small detail, a smear of mud on the rug near the desk, shaped like the heel of a boot. "We must secure this room," Hastings said. "No one touches anything until Sherlock Holmes arrives. Colonel, can you send for the local constable?" "I'll telephone at once," the colonel replied, though his hand shook as he holstered his revolver. "But the nearest police are in Thornwick, and this fog will delay them." As the group dispersed to dress and await the authorities, Hastings lingered, his candle illuminating the grim scene. Crane's death was no accident. The precision of the wound suggested intent, and the letter opener, likely taken from the desk, implied an impulsive act. Yet the open window and the mud suggested something else, an outsider perhaps, or a carefully staged deception. He stepped into the corridor, where Clara waited, her eyes searching his. "Captain Hastings?" she said softly. "Do you think this is connected to the carriage? To that thing we saw?" "It is too early to say," Hastings replied, echoing the measured tone he'd heard Sherlock Holmes use so often. "But I assure you, mademoiselle, my friend will uncover the truth." By dawn, the house was in a state of controlled chaos. The local constable, a stout man named Inspector Japp, arrived with 2 officers, their boots leaving wet tracks on the marble floor. Japp, a pragmatic sort with a penchant for jumping to conclusions, surveyed the library with a scowl. "Looks like a robbery gone wrong," he declared. "Some vagrant likely saw the open window and took his chance." Hastings frowned. "The window was unforced, Inspector, and a vagrant would hardly pause to use a letter opener when a knife would do." Japp bristled but said nothing, directing his men to cordon off the room. The household gathered in the drawing room, where Lady Beatrice had finally appeared, her composure intact, but her eyes red-rimmed. "This is monstrous," she said, her voice low. "Mr. Crane was here on my account, handling estate matters. Who would do this?" "A pertinent question," came a voice. Room's gloom. All heads turned to see Sherlock Holmes, his small, neat frame silhouetted against the morning light. His eyes, bright and piercing, swept over the group, missing nothing. He wore a traveling coat, dusted with dew, and carried a small valise. "Holmes!" Hastings exclaimed, relief flooding him. "You made good time!" "The early train was prompt for once," Holmes replied, setting down his valise. "Now, Hastings, tell me everything. And you, Inspector, kindly refrain from trampling the scene until I've seen it." Japp muttered but stepped aside as Holmes entered the library. He moved with the grace of a cat, his gaze darting from the body to the desk, the window, the rug. He knelt by the mud smear, producing a magnifying glass from his pocket. "Interesting," he murmured. "A man's boot. Size 9 with a distinctive wear pattern? Fresh, but not from tonight's dew. This mud is dry." He rose, examining the letter opener. No fingerprints, naturally. The handle is too ornate for clarity, but the blade, clean save for the blood. A single deliberate thrust. He turned to the scattered papers, his fingers deftly sorting them. "A will, you say, Hastings? Most curious." Holmes stepped to the window, peering into the fog. "No tracks outside, I presume?" "None," Hastings confirmed. "Old Tom checked at dawn." Holmes's lips curved into a faint smile. "Then we have a puzzle, my friend. A man is murdered, a window is open, yet no one enters or leaves. A phantom carriage haunts the grounds, yet leaves no trace. And this button." He produced the brass button from Hastings's description, turning it in the light. "Suggests a mind that wishes to be seen, yet not known." He faced the household, his expression serene but commanding. "Mesdames et messieurs, a crime has been committed under this roof, and I, Sherlock Holmes, will uncover its truth. No detail is too small, no secret too well hidden. Now who will speak first?" The room fell silent, each face a mask of fear, guilt, or defiance. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the stark outline of Blackthorn Hall and the secrets it held. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Order. The morning light, filtered through the lifting fog, cast a pale glow over Blackthorn Hall, doing little to dispel the pall of suspicion that hung over its inhabitants. Captain Arthur Hastings stood in the drawing room, watching as Sherlock Holmes, with his characteristic precision, began to impose order on the chaos left by Victor Crane's murder. Holmes had requested the household assemble after his brief examination of the library, and now they sat or stood in uneasy silence, their faces betraying a spectrum of emotions: fear, curiosity, and in some cases, barely concealed hostility. Holmes stood by the fireplace, his small, immaculate figure commanding the room without effort. His hand expressions. Inspector Japp lingered near the door, his notebook open, though his skeptical glance suggested he placed little faith in Holmes's methods. Hastings, ever the loyal observer, positioned himself near a window, noting the time, 9:32 a.m., and the faint outlines of the grounds now visible through the dissipating mist. "Mesdames et messieurs," Holmes began, his voice clear and measured, with that faint Belgian accent that lent his words an air of authority. "A crime of singular audacity has occurred in this house. Mr. Victor Crane, a solicitor of no small repute, lies dead, and the circumstances suggest a mind both cunning and deliberate. I will unravel this mystery, but I require your cooperation. Each of you will account for your movements last night, and I warn you, do not mistake me for a man who tolerates deception." Colonel Ashford, seated in an armchair, cleared his throat. "I've told Captain Hastings already," he said, his voice strained but firm. "I was in my room, asleep, until the scream woke me at around 2 in the morning. I heard no one in the corridor, saw nothing unusual." Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. "And you, Mademoiselle Clara?" Clara Ashford, perched on the edge of a sofa, met Holmes's gaze with a steadiness that belied her pale complexion. "I was in my room, as I said. I couldn't sleep. How could one, with all this talk of carriages and ghosts? I was reading by candlelight when I heard the scream. I came out immediately and met Uncle Reginald in the corridor." "Reading what, mademoiselle?" Holmes asked, his tone deceptively casual. Clara hesitated, then replied, "A novel, Jane Eyre. I find it comforting." Holmes' lips twitched, as if noting something significant, but he moved on. "Dr. Grayson?" The physician adjusted his spectacles, his fingers betraying a slight tremor. "I was in the West Wing, in my room, organizing my medical supplies. I often work late. It helps me think. The scream brought me to the library, where I confirmed Mr. Crane's death." "And you heard nothing before the scream? No footsteps, no voices?" Holmes pressed. "Nothing," Grayson said, though his eyes darted to the floor. The house was silent. Holmes turned to Julian Marlowe, who leaned against the wall, his arms crossed and his expression sullen. "Monsieur Julian, you claim you were reading. May I know what?" Julian's jaw tightened. "A volume of Shelley's poetry. I don't sleep well here. Too many shadows." "Poetry," Holmes repeated, his tone neutral but his eyes keen. "And you, Lady Beatrice?" The widow, seated regally in a high-backed chair, raised her chin. "I retired early, as I mentioned." "Very well. Inspector Japp, may I see the library again? And Hastings, please accompany me." The library was as they had left it, save for the constable standing guard. Crane's body remained, now covered with a sheet, but the room's details stood out starkly in the daylight. Holmes moved with purpose, his magnifying glass reappearing as he examined the desk, the scattered papers, and the smear of mud on the rug. He paused at the window, noting the latch's position. "Still unforced," he murmured, and yet the window was open. Curious. He picked up the crumpled paper Hastings had found, a draft of a will. "This document," Holmes said, scanning it, "alters the distribution of the Ashford estate. Colonel Ashford's fortune, it seems, was to be divided differently, with significant portions redirected. Mr. Crane was not here merely to advise Hastings. He was rewriting the future of this family." Hastings frowned. "You think the will is the motive?" "It is a thread," Holmes said, folding the paper. "But there are others. the button, the carriage, the mud, all pieces of a puzzle. Tell me, Hastings, what did you observe about our suspects this morning? Hastings considered. Clara seemed composed but nervous. Her hands never stopped moving. Grayson was jumpy, almost too eager to help. Julian's sullenness felt like a mask. And Lady Beatrice? She's too controlled, as if she's hiding something. The Colonel's shaken, but he's trying to hold the line. Excellent, Hastings, Holmes said, his eyes gleaming. You see, but you do not yet observe. The little grey cells, they must work harder. For instance, why does Mademoiselle Clara choose Jane Eyre on such a night? Why does Monsieur Julian claim poetry, yet his hands bear no ink stains from turning pages? And why does Dr. Grayson, a man of science, tremble at the mention of a scream? Holmes knelt by the rug again, examining the mud. This is not from the grounds, he said. It is clay, not the chalky soil of Sussex. It comes from elsewhere, perhaps a riverbank or a quarry. We must learn where. He rose, dusting his hands. Now, let us speak with the groundskeeper again. This old Tom intrigues me. They found Tom near the stables, tending to a horse with a care that belied his weathered appearance. He straightened as Holmes approached, his eyes wary. Monsieur Tom, Holmes said, his tone courteous. Tell me again of this carriage. Every detail, if you please. Tom rubbed his jaw. It was black, sir, with no lanterns. 2 horses, dark as night, galloping like the devil was after 'em. I saw it clear as day by the yew tree. Then it was gone. No tracks, no nothing. And that man in the cloak, he stood there, still as death, then vanished with the carriage. And the button? Holmes asked, producing it. Found it right there. Tom. No disturbance in the grass, he noted. The button was placed, not dropped. A message, perhaps, or a distraction. They returned to the house, where Japp was questioning the servants. Holmes listened briefly, then drew Hastings aside. The servants heard nothing unusual before the scream, which is itself unusual. A house this old creaks with every step, yet no one heard a struggle. The killer was either known to Crane or moved with extraordinary stealth. Holmes paused, his gaze distant. There is order in this chaos, Hastings. The carriage, the button, the mud, the will, they are not random. They are the work of a mind that plans, that calculates. But for what purpose? As they rejoined the household, Holmes's demeanor shifted to one of polite detachment. I will require a map of the estate, he said to the Colonel. Every path, every outbuilding, and a list of all visitors to Blackthorn Hall in the past month. No detail is too small. The Colonel nodded, looking relieved to have a task. Clara watched Holmes with a mixture of awe and apprehension, while Julian's scowl deepened. Lady Beatrice excused herself again, claiming fatigue, and Grayson offered to escort her. Holmes's eyes followed them, narrowing slightly. Hastings, he said softly. Tonight we watch. The killer is among us, and they will move again. The little grey cells, they are already at work. Outside, the fog had lifted, revealing the stark beauty of Blackthorn Hall's grounds. But to Hastings, the estate seemed more like a chessboard, with Holmes as the master player and a murderer lurking among the pieces. Chapter 4. The questions begin. The morning at Blackthorn Hall wore on with a heaviness that seemed to seep into the very walls, as if the murder of Victor Crane had stained the air itself. By 11:15 a.m., as noted by the steady ticking of the drawing-room clock, Sherlock Holmes had transformed the somber atmosphere into a theatre of inquiry. The household, still reeling from the night's horror, had been summoned once more to the drawing-room, where Holmes now paced with the precision of a metronome, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Captain Arthur Hastings stood near the fireplace, observing his friend's methodical approach with a mix of admiration and unease. Inspector Japp, relegated to a corner with his notebook, watched with barely concealed impatience. Holmes began his interrogations with a disarming courtesy that Hastings knew masked a relentless pursuit of truth. Mesdames et messieurs, he said, his voice clear and resonant, we are gathered to unravel the threads of a most intricate crime. Each of you holds a piece of the puzzle, whether you know it or not. I will speak with you one by one, and I ask for candor. The little grey cells, They do not rest, and they will uncover what is hidden. He turned first to Colonel Ashford, who sat rigid in his armchair, his military bearing fraying under the weight of the morning's events. "Colonel," Holmes said, "you mentioned that Mr. Crane was here to handle estate matters. Precisely what matters, and why was a new will being drafted?" The Colonel's hands tightened on the armrests. "Crane was my solicitor for years," he said. "The estate is complicated. Debts, old promises, family obligations. I wished to ensure Clara's future and settle some bequests. Crane was revising the will to reflect my wishes. And these revisions?" Holmes pressed. "Did they disadvantage anyone in this room?" The Colonel hesitated, his eyes flickering toward his niece. "Not intentionally. But such changes always ruffle feathers. I hadn't shared the details yet, not even with Clara." Holmes nodded, his expression inscrutable, and moved to Clara Ashford. She sat with her hands folded, her face pale but composed. "Mademoiselle Clara," Holmes said gently, "you were reading Jane Eyre last night. A curious choice for a sleepless night. Tell me, what is it about this novel that comforts you?" Clara's lips parted in surprise, then closed. "It's familiar," she said. "I've read it since I was a girl. The story of a woman finding her strength. It calms me when I'm troubled." "And you were troubled last night," Holmes said. Not a question. "By the carriage, yes, but perhaps by something else? A conversation, perhaps? Or a letter?" Clara's fingers twitched, but she shook her head. "No, nothing like that. Just the strangeness of these nights." Holmes's gaze lingered, then shifted to Dr. Lionel Grayson, who was polishing his spectacles with a handkerchief. "Doctor," Holmes said, "you were in the West Wing, organizing medical supplies. At 2 in the morning? A most dedicated physician. What supplies, precisely?" Grayson blinked rapidly. "Oh, just routine inventory. Bandages, laudanum, antiseptics. I find it soothing to keep things in order." "Order," Holmes repeated, his tone soft but pointed. "Yet you did not hear the scream until it woke the house. Curious, for a man so attuned to his surroundings." Grayson flushed, stammering, "The West Wing is far from the library. The walls are thick." Holmes moved on to Julian Marlowe, who stood by the window, his posture tense. "Monsieur Julian," Holmes said, "you claim to have been reading Shelley. Which poem, if I may ask?" Julian's eyes narrowed. "Does it matter?" "I was reading. I didn't hear anything until the scream." "It matters," Holmes said, his voice like silk over steel, "because details reveal the truth. A man reading poetry at night might leave traces, ink on his fingers, a book left open. Yet your hands are clean, and your room, when I glanced earlier, showed no such book." Julian's face darkened. "Are you accusing me, sir?" "I accuse no one," Holmes said calmly. "I observe." Finally, Holmes turned to Lady Beatrice Marlowe, who sat with the poise awake enough to join us after the scream. A remarkable recovery. "I am a light sleeper," she replied coolly. "The draught was mild and the scream was piercing." "And your business with Mr. Crane?" Holmes asked. "You said he was here on your account." "Legal matters," she said. Her voice clipped. "My late husband's estate is entangled with the Ashfords. Crane was clarifying certain claims." Holmes nodded, stepping back to survey the group. "Thank you," he said. "Each of you has been most illuminating. Now I will examine the grounds with Captain Hastings. Inspector Japp, please ensure the library remains untouched." Japp grunted, but complied, while Holmes led Hastings outside. The air was crisp, the fog now a thin veil that revealed the sprawling lawns and the ancient yew tree where the Phantom Carriage had vanished. Holmes moved with purpose, his magnifying glass in hand, inspecting the ground near the tree. "No tracks, as Tom said," he murmured, "yet the button was placed here. Why?" He knelt, examining the grass. "The dew is undisturbed, Hastings. No one walked here last night." The button was left before the dew fell. Before midnight, perhaps. Hastings frowned. But the carriage was seen after midnight, and Crane was killed later still. Precisely, Holmes said, his eyes gleaming. The carriage, the button, the murder, they are connected, but not in the way our friends believe. Come, let us see the stables. Old Tom was there, mucking out a stall. Holmes questioned him again, his tone gentle but probing. You saw the cloaked figure by the yew tree. Describe him, if you please. Tom scratched his head. Tall, sir, and thin. Wore a long cloak, black or dark gray. His face, I couldn't see it, not in the fog. But he stood still like he was watching the house. And the horses? Holmes asked. Black as coal, sir. No markings I could see. They moved fast, but silent-like. Unnatural it was. Holmes thanked him and led Hastings back toward the house. The carriage is a distraction, he said softly, a theatrical flourish to unsettle the household. But the mud in the library, the will, the letter opener, these are real. The killer is among us, Hastings, and they are clever. They returned to the drawing room, where the household remained, their conversations hushed. Holmes requested the estate map from the colonel, who produced a detailed chart of the grounds, marked with paths, outbuildings, and the nearby river. Holmes studied it, his finger tracing a path to a disused quarry a mile away. Clay soil, he said, almost to himself. The source of our mud, perhaps. He turned to the group, his voice commanding attention. I will need to see your rooms, he said. A small intrusion, but necessary. Who will begin? Clara volunteered first. Dated 2 days prior, requesting a private meeting. Curious, Holmes said, pocketing the letter with Clara's permission. Grayson's room was cluttered with medical supplies, as he'd claimed, but Holmes paused at a pair of boots by the door. He scraped a speck of mud from the heel, comparing it to the library sample. Similar, he murmured, but not conclusive. Julian's room was sparse, with no poetry in sight, only a cigarette case and a crumpled newspaper. Lady Beatrice's room was elegant, with a vial of sleeping draught on the dresser, half empty, Holmes noted. The colonel's room yielded little, save for a locked drawer that Holmes marked for later investigation. As they left the rooms, Holmes whispered to Hastings, The threads tighten, my friend. The will, the mud, the letter. Each points to a motive, a moment, a mistake. Tonight, we must be vigilant. The killer will not rest, and neither will Sherlock Holmes. The clock struck noon, and the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move in this deadly game. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. By the early afternoon, Blackthorn Hall seemed to pulse with an undercurrent of dread, as if the very stones of the old estate sensed the unraveling of its secrets. The clock in the drawing room struck 1:47 p.m., its chimes echoing through the tense silence that had settled over the household. Sherlock Holmes, ever the orchestrator of order amidst chaos, had concluded his initial interviews and inspections, and now sat in a high-backed chair, his fingers steepled, his eyes half-closed in that peculiar state of contemplation that Captain Arthur Hastings knew signaled the furious working of his little grey cells. Inspector Japp, however, was far less composed. Pacing the room, his notebook flapping like an agitated bird, he announced his theory with the confidence of a man who preferred simplicity to subtlety. "It's clear as day, Mr. Holmes," he declared, jabbing a finger toward the window. "Some vagrant from the village, likely a poacher or a thief, slipped in through that open window, saw Crane working late, and stabbed him in a panic. The letter opener was handy, and off the blighter went, back into the fog." Holmes opened one eye, regarding Japp with the faintest trace of amusement. "A compelling narrative, Inspector," he said, his tone deceptively mild. "But pray, explain the absence of footprints outside the window, the undisturbed dew, and the fact that the letter opener was driven with precision into Mr. Crane's heart. A panicked vagrant, I think, would not be so tidy. Japp flushed, muttering something about modern criminals, but Holmes had already turned his attention to the household, who sat in a semicircle, their faces a study in unease. Colonel Ashford clutched a glass of brandy, his knuckles white. Claire incessantly, while Julian Marlowe slouched in a corner, his gaze sullen. Lady Beatrice Marlowe, serene as ever, sipped tea, though her fingers betrayed a slight tremor. "Mesdames et messieurs," Holmes said, rising with a fluid grace, "Inspector Japp's theory, while earnest, is what I call a red herring, a distraction from the truth. The killer is not some phantom from the village, but someone within these walls. Let us consider the facts, not the fancies." He began to pace, his voice measured but compelling. "Mr. Crane was killed between 1:30 and 2 a.m., based on Dr. Grayson's examination. The window was open, yet no one entered or left, as the dew outside was undisturbed. The mud on the rug, clay, not local soil, suggests a connection to a specific place, perhaps a quarry. The will, found crumpled near the body, indicates a motive tied to the Ashford estate. And then there is the button, with its crescent moon and thorn placed deliberately by the yew tree. These are not the acts of a vagrant, but of a mind that plans and misleads. Japp snorted. "You're making it too complicated, Holmes. Why not the simplest explanation?" "Because, Inspector," Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming, "the simplest explanation is often the least true. The killer wishes us to believe in an outsider, hence the open window, the tales of a phantom carriage. But I, Sherlock Holmes, see through such tricks. The truth lies in the details." He turned to the group, his gaze piercing. "Let us test this red herring further. Colonel Ashford, you mentioned debts tied to the estate. Who knew of the will's revisions?" The colonel hesitated, then said, "Only Crane and I discussed it in detail. But Clara knew I intended to secure her future, and Lady Beatrice was aware of certain claims, as they affected her late husband's share." Holmes nodded, his attention shifting to Lady Beatrice. "And you, madam, what precisely were these claims?" Lady Beatrice set down her teacup with deliberate care. "My husband, Lord Marlowe, was a distant cousin of the Colonel's. His will left certain assets tied to Blackthorn Hall, but they were contested. Crane was resolving the matter to ensure Julian's inheritance." Julian's head snapped up. "My inheritance? Mother, you never told me—" "There was no need," Lady Beatrice said sharply. "It was a legal formality, nothing more." Holmes's lips curved slightly. "A formality worth killing for."
"Uncle's plans, but I didn't meet him. I was uneasy about it." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Uneasy? A precise word. Why?" Clara looked down. "He was too familiar. His manner suggested more than business." Holmes nodded, filing the information away, then addressed Dr. Grayson. "Doctor, the mud on your boots, clay, like that in the library. Have you visited the quarry near the river recently?" Grayson started, his spectacles nearly slipping from his nose. "The quarry? No, I walk the grounds sometimes for exercise. Perhaps I passed near it." "Perhaps," Holmes said, his tone neutral but his gaze intense. He turned to the group at large. "Each of you has a motive, however small. Money, inheritance, secrets. But only one of you has the cunning to stage this crime. I will find you." The room fell silent, the weight of Holmes's words pressing on every heart. Hastings, watching from the sidelines, felt a chill. Holmes was laying a trap, sowing doubt to flush out the truth. But the killer, he knew, was watching too, calculating their next move. Holmes excused himself to examine the grounds again, beckoning Hastings to follow. Outside, the air was crisp, the lawns sparkling with fading dew. Holmes led the way to the quarry, a mile from the hall, where the ground was indeed clay-heavy. He scooped a sample, comparing it to the mud from Grayson's boots and the library. "Identical," he said. "Someone was here, Hastings, and brought this mud into the house. But why?" They returned to the yew tree, where Holmes examined the spot where the button was found. "Still no tracks," he murmured. "The carriage is a fiction, designed to distract. But the button? It is real? A signature. The crescent moon and thorn, a symbol, perhaps, of a secret society or a personal vendetta." Back in the house, Holmes requested to see Crane's belongings. The solicitor's room was tidy, his briefcase containing legal documents, a pocket watch, and a small notebook. Holmes flipped through the notebook, pausing at a page with a sketch of the same crescent moon and thorn symbol, alongside a cryptic note. "Meet C at midnight, East Wing. Trust no one." "C," Holmes said softly. "Clara? The Colonel? Or someone else?" Hastings frowned. "It could be anyone. But why meet in secret?" "To conceal a truth," Holmes replied. "Or to set a trap." Crane was lured to the library, Hastings. The killer knew he would be there. As evening approached, Holmes gathered the household once more. "Tonight," he said, "we will lock the house as before. But I will be watching. The killer believes they have outwitted us, but they have not reckoned with Sherlock Holmes." The group dispersed, their faces etched with fear and suspicion. Hastings, following Holmes to his—
"We'll find it, my friend, before another life is lost." Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the shadows of Blackthorn Hall grew long, as if reaching for the secrets buried within.
Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail.
Lading the afternoon light filtered through the mullioned windows of Blackthorn Hall, casting intricate patterns on the polished floors. Yet it did little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere that clung to the house. By 4:12 p.m., as the drawing-room clock solemnly declared, Sherlock Holmes had settled into a methodical rhythm, his mind sifting through the tangle of motives and misdirections surrounding Victor Crane's murder. Captain Arthur Hastings, ever attentive, stood by the fireplace, watching his friend with a mixture of awe and anticipation. Holmes's genius lay not in grand gestures, but in the minute, the overlooked, a gesture, a word, a fleeting inconsistency that others dismissed but he seized upon. Holmes had requested the household remain available for further questions, and they sat in uneasy silence, their eyes darting between one another and the diminutive detective who seemed to hold their fates in his neatly manicured hands. Inspector Japp, relegated to the sidelines, scribbled in his notebook, muttering about fanciful theories. Holmes, however, was undeterred, his attention fixed on a small detail that had emerged during his morning inspections, a detail he now intended to unravel. He rose, his movements precise, and addressed the group. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a conductor before a symphony, "the truth of Mr. Crane's death lies not in the broad strokes, but in the subtleties. A single clue, properly understood, can illuminate the entire puzzle. Let us consider such a clue now." He produced the brass button, its crescent moon and thorn symbol glinting in the light. "This," he said, holding it aloft, "was found by the yew tree, placed deliberately, I believe, to suggest a connection to the so-called Phantom Carriage. But it is more than a prop in a ghost story. It is a signature, a mark of intent. Who among you recognizes this symbol?" The room stirred, but no one spoke. Clara Ashford's fingers tightened on her handkerchief. Dr. Lionel Grayson adjusted his spectacles, and Julian Marlowe's scowl deepened. Lady Beatrice Marlowe's expression remained impassive, though her eyes followed the button with a flicker of interest. Colonel Ashford cleared his throat, his voice hoarse. "I've never seen it before," he said. "It's not an Ashford crest, if that's what you mean." Holmes's lips curved slightly. "I did not expect it to be, Colonel, but let us explore further. The button was found outside, yet the murder occurred within. The killer then wishes us to look outward, to suspect an intruder, a phantom. But I, Sherlock Holmes, look inward, to the heart of this house." He turned to the desk where Crane's papers still
lay under the watchful eye of a constable. Among them was the crumpled draft of the will, which Holmes now unfolded with care. "This document," he said, "reveals much. It reallocates the Ashford estate, favouring Mademoiselle Clara and reducing certain claims, those of Lady Beatrice and her son, perhaps. But there is another detail, one less obvious." He pointed to a faint smudge on the paper's edge, a trace of ink, not from the pen that wrote the will, but from another source. "This ink," Holmes said, "is not the black of Crane's fountain pen, but blue and slightly faded. It suggests another hand touched this paper, perhaps in haste. Hastings, did you notice anything unusual about the desk?" Hastings frowned, recalling the scene. "The papers were scattered, but there was an ink bottle, blue ink, I think, near the edge. It wasn't spilled, though." "Precisely," Holmes said, his eyes gleaming. "The bottle was undisturbed, yet this smudge exists. Someone handled this will before Crane's death. Someone with blue ink on their fingers. And yet none of you admitted to being in the library before the scream." The group exchanged glances, their unease palpable. Holmes continued, his voice soft but relentless. "Let us consider another detail, the mud on the library rug, clay from the quarry, identical to that on Dr. Grayson's boots. Doctor, you claim to have walked the grounds for exercise, yet your boots were clean this morning, save for that small speck. How do you explain this?" Grayson's face paled, his hands trembling. I told you, I walk often. The mud must have been from an earlier day. I clean my boots regularly." Holmes nodded, as if satisfied. But Hastings knew better. Holmes was building a web, and each question tightened the strands. He turned to Clara. "Mademoiselle, the letter from Crane, found in your book. It requested a meeting at midnight in the East Wing. Why did you not attend?" Clara's eyes widened. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Mr. Crane's tone was strange, almost insistent. I didn't trust him. I stayed in my room." Holmes's gaze softened, but only slightly. "And yet you kept the letter, tucked in Jane Eyre. A curious place to hide it, unless you wished it to be found." Clara flushed, but before she could respond, Holmes moved to Julian. "Monsieur Julian, your room contained no poetry but a cigarette case with a faint trace of blue ink on its clasp. A small detail, but significant. Care to explain?" Julian's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about. I smoke, yes, but ink. You're grasping at straws, Holmes." Holmes's smile was thin. "The little grey cells do not grasp, monsieur. They observe." He stepped back, addressing the group. "Each of you has a connection to—" "We'll speak with each of you again, privately, tomorrow. For now, I must consult the grounds once more." Holmes beckoned Hastings to follow, and they stepped into the crisp October air. The quarry, a mile away, was their destination, and as they walked, Holmes spoke softly. "The ink, Hastings, is the key. It links the will to someone in the house, someone who touched it before Crane's death. And the mud? It confirms the killer's movements. They were at the quarry, perhaps to stage the carriage myth, and then in the library.
At the quarry, Holmes examined the clay, noting its texture and color. "This is no casual walk," he said. "The mud was carried deliberately, perhaps to mislead, but why? To suggest an outsider, or to hide a truth closer to home?" They returned to the yew tree, where Holmes knelt again, his magnifying glass tracing the ground. "The button," he said, "was placed here to draw attention. But it is the ink that betrays the killer. We must find its source." Back in the house, Holmes requested to see the servants' quarters, a request that surprised the colonel, but was granted. The butler, a stoic man named Perkins, led them to a small room where the servants' supplies were kept. Among them was a bottle of blue ink, identical to the smudge on the will. Holmes examined it, noting its position on a shelf, accessible to anyone in the house. "Interesting," he murmured. "This ink is common, yet its presence on the will is not." As evening fell, Holmes gathered the household for dinner, a tense affair where conversation was stilted and eyes avoided contact. He watched, his silence more probing than any question. After dinner, he drew Hastings aside. "Tonight we set a watch," he said. "The killer is nervous. They will act, perhaps to cover their tracks. We must be ready." Hastings nodded, his pulse quickening. "Do you know who it is, Holmes?" "Not yet," Holmes replied, his eyes distant. "But the clue, the ink, the mud, the button, points to a mind that overreaches. They believe they are cleverer than Sherlock Holmes, but they are mistaken." As the clock struck 8 p.m., the house settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. Hastings, stationed in the corridor near the library, felt the weight of the night pressing in. Holmes, somewhere in the shadows, was watching, waiting for the killer to reveal themselves through the smallest, most telling detail. Chapter 7. More Lies Surface. The twilight of the third day at Blackthorn Hall, October 26th, draped the estate. Arthur Hastings, standing near the window, felt the tension coiling tighter, sensing that the clues, the blue ink smudge, the quarry mud, the crescent moon button, were beginning to unravel a deeper web of deceit. Inspector Japp, his skepticism now laced with reluctant curiosity, leaned against the doorframe, his notebook open but his pen idle. Holmes's relentless probing had shaken the household, and the revelations of the day, the ink on Julian's cigarette case, the mud on Grayson's boots, Clara's hidden letter, had exposed cracks in their carefully crafted facades. Yet Holmes, with his unerring logic, sensed that more lies lay buried, waiting to be excavated. "Mesdames et messieurs," Holmes began, his voice a blend of courtesy and command. "The murder of Mr. Victor Crane is a puzzle of many layers. We have uncovered motives, greed, fear, betrayal, but the truth remains obscured by deception. Tonight I seek the hidden truths, the secrets you have guarded too long. Let us begin with the will." He held up the crumpled draft, its blue ink smudge glinting in the firelight. This document, which threatened to reshape the Ashford estate, was handled by someone with blue ink on their fingers. Yet none of you admit to touching it before Crane's death. Why? Colonel Ashford, his face drawn, shifted uncomfortably. "I told you, Holmes. I discussed the will with Crane, but I didn't touch the draft. He was revising it based on my instructions." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And yet, Colonel, your instructions were vague. You spoke of debts, of securing Clara's future, but you omitted a critical detail. Who stood to lose the most from these changes?" The Colonel's hands tightened on his brandy glass, his voice low. "Lady Beatrice and Julian. The old will favored them due to my late cousin's claims. The new one, It prioritized Clara. A gasp escaped Clara, her eyes wide. "Uncle, you never told me. I didn't want to burden you," the colonel said, his voice cracking. "You've had enough to bear, with your parents gone." Holmes turned to Lady Beatrice, whose composure was a brittle mask. "Madame, you knew of these changes, did you not? Crane was handling your late husband's claims, yet you concealed a meeting with him 2 nights ago, in this very house." Lady Beatrice's lips pressed thin, her eyes flashing. "It was a private matter, Monsieur Holmes. Crane was overstepping, suggesting I persuade the colonel to delay the revisions. I refused." "And yet," Holmes said, his tone silky, "you did not mention this to anyone. Why? Was it because you feared the loss of your son's inheritance?" Julian Marlowe leapt to his feet, his face flushed. "Leave her alone, Holmes. I told you I overheard Crane talking about cutting me out, but I didn't do anything. I was angry, yes, but I stayed in my room."
Ignite a crime. Your cigarette case, marked with blue ink, places you near the will. Did you confront Crane that night? Julian's hands clenched, his voice trembling. "No, I swear it. I took a letter from his desk earlier that day. I wanted to know what he was planning. It had blue ink on it. Maybe that's how—" Holmes raised an eyebrow. "A letter? And where is it now?" Julian faltered, his eyes darting to his mother. "I burned it. It was nothing, just legal jargon." Holmes's smile was thin. "Burned, you say? Convenient. But the truth, monsieur, does not burn so easily." He turned to Dr. Grayson, who was polishing his spectacles with a nervous intensity. "Doctor, you admitted to being in the library at 1:30 a.m., yet you claim you took only a journal. But your boots bore quarry mud, and your hands, when I examined them, showed traces of ink. Were you, perhaps, involved in more than you admit?" Grayson's face paled, his voice shaking. "I told you. I took a book and left. The mud. I must have walked near the quarry days ago. And the ink. I handle papers. It's common." Holmes stepped closer, his voice soft but piercing. "Common, doctor, yet specific. The ink on the will matches that in the servants' quarters, accessible to all, but used by few. And the mud, fresh, not days old. You were at the quarry, perhaps to aid in the fiction of the Phantom Carriage?" Grayson's spectacles slipped, his hands trembling. "No, I walked there, yes, but only to clear my head. I had no part in any carriage." Holmes nodded, as if filing away the response, then turned to Clara. "Mademoiselle, your silence about Crane's letter troubled me. His advances were improper, yes, but there is more. Did you see anyone else in the library that night, before the scream?" Clara's hands twisted her handkerchief, her voice barely audible. I thought I saw a shadow, near the east wing, before I went to bed. I didn't think it mattered, but it was near midnight." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "A shadow, mademoiselle. Most intriguing. And did this shadow move or speak?" "No," Clara said, her voice trembling. "It was just there, by the corridor. I thought it was my imagination, with all the talk of the carriage." Holmes paced, his mind clearly racing. A shadow, a letter, a smudge, a fiction. The lies multiply, but the truth draws near. The Phantom Carriage, I suspect.
And yet the button bears a symbol, a crescent moon and thorn, a coincidence perhaps, or a clue to a deeper deception. The room fell silent. The weight of Holmes' words, pressing on every heart. Hastings, watching from the sidelines, felt a chill. Holmes was peeling back layers of deceit, exposing affairs, financial schemes, and bitter feuds. The killer, he knew, was among them, their lies unraveling under Holmes' scrutiny. Holmes stepped back, his voice calm but commanding. "Tonight we watch, mesdames et messieurs. The killer is nervous, their secrets exposed. They will act to protect themselves, and I, Sherlock Holmes, will be ready." As the household dispersed, their faces pale, Holmes drew Hastings aside. "The lies surface, my friend," he whispered. "The shadow Clara saw, the burned letter, the phantom thorn, they point to a conspiracy, not a single act. The killer is close, but another hand stirs the pot. Tomorrow, we set the trap." Outside, the wind howled, carrying the faint echo of hooves, or perhaps it was only the creak of the old house, groaning under the weight of its secrets. Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The atmosphere in Blackthorn Hall, as the clock struck 7:43 p.m. on the third day of Sherlock Holmes' investigation, was a taut wire, ready to snap. The household, worn by sleepless nights and the relentless probing of the diminutive detective, gathered in the drawing room, their faces etched with a mix of dread and exhaustion. Captain Arthur Hastings, standing by the window, felt the weight of the case pressing upon him, the air thick with unspoken secrets. Holmes, however, remained a beacon of calm, his neat figure seated by the fireplace, his eyes gleaming with the quiet intensity of a man who sensed the puzzle's edges coming into focus. The day had been one of mounting tension. Holmes's interviews, his relentless pursuit of details, the blue ink smudge, the clay mud, the cryptic button, had unsettled the household, each member feeling the noose of suspicion tightening. Inspector Japp, though still clinging to his theory of an outside intruder, had grown quieter, his confidence eroded by Holmes's meticulous observations. The servants, too, moved with hushed steps, their eyes darting nervously, as if the walls themselves might betray them. Holmes rose, his movements deliberate, and addressed the group. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, his voice a velvet blade, "we stand at a crossroads in this affair. A man is dead, his life taken with precision and purpose. The clues, the will, the mud, the button, point to a truth that lies within this house. Tonight I sense one of you will break, and a piece of that truth will emerge. Let us see who it is." His words hung in the air. Marlowe, slouched in a corner, glared at Holmes with barely concealed defiance. Lady Beatrice Marlowe, her composure a fragile mask, sipped her tea with studied calm, while Colonel Ashford's face was a map of worry, his brandy glass empty once more. Holmes turned to Clara, his tone gentle but probing. "Mademoiselle Clara, you have been most forthcoming, yet I sense you hold something back. The letter from Mr. Crane, requesting a midnight meeting. Why did it trouble you so deeply?" Clara's lips parted, then closed, her eyes filling with tears. I didn't want to say," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Mr. Crane was improper. He suggested that if I were kind to him, he could ensure my inheritance was larger. I refused, but he was insistent. I was afraid to meet him, afraid of what he might do." A murmur ran through the room, and the Colonel's face reddened with fury. "That scoundrel!" he roared, slamming his glass on the table. "If I'd known, I'd have thrown him out myself." Holmes raised a hand, silencing him. "Your anger is noted, Colonel, but let us focus. Mademoiselle Clara, did you tell anyone of this?" Clara shook her head, tears spilling over. "No, I was ashamed. I thought I could handle it myself. Holmes's gaze softened, but only for a moment. He turned to Julian Marlowe. Monsieur Julian, you were aware of the will's revisions, were you not? Your mother mentioned claims tied to your inheritance. Did you discuss this with Mr. Crane? Julian's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing. I told you. I didn't know the details. Mother handled it all. But, he hesitated, his voice dropping. I overheard Crane talking to her 2 nights ago in the library. He said something about cutting Julian out entirely. I didn't understand it, but it made me angry. Lady Beatrice's cup clattered against its saucer. Julian, you never told me this. Because you treat me like a child, Julian snapped, his voice raw. Always managing, always controlling. I'm not a boy anymore, Mother. The room fell silent, the outburst hanging like smoke. Holmes's eyes gleamed, as if a piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. A most revealing confession, Monsieur Julian, he said. Anger is a powerful motive. And you, Lady Beatrice, why did you not share this conversation with me? Lady Beatrice's composure wavered, her lips pressing into a thin line. It was a private matter, she said coldly. Crane was overstepping, yes, but I handled it. I told him to revise the will as I saw fit. He agreed. Holmes nodded, his gaze shifting to Dr. Grayson. And you
Couldn't sleep. I went to the library to fetch a book. Something to calm my nerves. Crane was there, alive, working at the desk. I didn't speak to him. I took a book and left. And what time was this? Holmes asked, his tone sharp. About 1:30, Grayson said, his hands shaking. I swear he was alive when I left. The room erupted in murmurs, and Japp stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. Why didn't you say this before, Grayson? That puts you at the scene just before the murder. I was afraid, Grayson cried, his voice cracking. I knew it looked bad. I didn't want to be suspected. Holmes raised a hand, restoring order. Your fear, Doctor, is understandable, but it complicates matters. You saw Mr. Crane at 1:30 a.m. alive. The scream came at 2:13 a.m. That narrows our window. And the book you took? What was it? Grayson swallowed. A medical journal. It's in my room. Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. We will verify this. For now, let us consider the implications. 3 of you, Clara, Julian, Grayson, have revealed truths that shift the puzzle. But one truth remains hidden. The identity of the killer. He turned to the Colonel. You locked a drawer in your room, Colonel. What does it contain? The Colonel's face paled. Personal papers, he said gruffly. Nothing to do with this. I will be the judge of that, Holmes said, his tone firm. Open it, if you please. The Colonel hesitated, then led Holmes, Hastings and Japp to his room. With a reluctant hand, he unlocked the drawer, revealing a bundle of letters tied with string. Holmes untied them, scanning the contents. Correspondence with Mr. Crane, he said, detailing debts, significant debts, to a man named Silas Thorne. A curious name, given the symbol on the button. The Colonel sank into a chair, his face ashen. Thorne was a creditor, he admitted. A ruthless man. Crane was negotiating with him to settle the debts, to protect the estate. I didn't want Clara to know how dire things were. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And this Silas Thorne, where is he now? I don't know, the Colonel said. Crane said he'd handle it. I haven't seen Thorne in months. Holmes folded the letters, his mind clearly racing. A creditor, a symbol, a murder. The threads tighten, Hastings. We are close to the heart of this matter. As they returned to the drawing room, Clara approached Holmes, her voice low. "Monsieur Holmes, I found something this afternoon. In the library, behind a book." She handed him, "Yet save us all." As the household dispersed for the night, Holmes drew Hastings aside. "The dam has broken, my friend," he said softly. "Clara's fear, Julian's anger, Grayson's omission, the Colonel's secrets. These are the cracks in the facade. The killer is watching, and they are growing careless. Tomorrow we set the trap." Outside, the night closed in, the stars obscured by clouds. Hastings felt a chill, not from the cold, but from the certainty that the truth was near, and with it, danger. Chapter 9. The Trap. The fourth day at Blackthorn Hall dawned with a stillness that seemed to mock the turmoil within its walls. By 8:17 a.m., as the drawing-room clock announced with its somber chimes, the household was a study in frayed nerves and guarded glances. Sherlock Holmes, however, radiated a calm intensity, his neat figure moving through the morning with the precision of a chess master positioning his pieces. Captain Arthur Hastings, standing by the window, felt the weight of the impending climax, sensing that Holmes was preparing to spring a trap that would ensnare the murderer of Victor Crane. The revelations of the previous evening, Clara's confession of Crane's improper advances, Julian's overheard threat to his inheritance, Dr. Grayson's admission of being in the library, and the Colonel's hidden debts to Silas Thorne had shifted the dynamics of the house. Each suspect now eyed the others with suspicion, their secrets laid bare like cards on a table. Inspector Japp, though still skeptical of Holmes's methods, had begun to defer to him, his notebook now filled with details he could no longer dismiss. Holmes gathered the household in the drawing-room after breakfast, his demeanor one of quiet authority. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, his voice clear and commanding, "we are close to the truth. The murder of Mr. Crane was no act of impulse but a carefully orchestrated crime, designed to mislead and distract. Tonight we will unmask the culprit. I will require your presence in the library at precisely 9 p.m. No one is to leave the house until then." A murmur of unease rippled through the group. Clara Ashford's hands trembled as she clutched her shawl, her eyes searching Holmes's face for reassurance. Dr. Lionel Grayson adjusted his spectacles, his face pale. Julian Marlowe's scowl deepened, his fingers drumming on the arm of his chair. Lady Beatrice Marlowe, her composure strained but intact, raised an eyebrow. "And what, Monsieur Holmes, do you intend to do in the library?" she asked, her tone cool. Holmes's smile was enigmatic. "I intend to recreate the conditions of the crime, madame. The killer believes they have outwitted us, but they have overlooked one fatal detail. Tonight, that detail will betray them." Colonel Ashford, his face haggard, spoke up. "Holmes, is this necessary? The house is already a tinderbox. Another night of this." "It is necessary, Colonel," Holmes interrupted, his voice firm. "The little grey cells have seen the pattern, and the trap is set. Trust in Sherlock Holmes." As the group dispersed, their reluctance palpable, Holmes drew Hastings aside. "The killer is restless, Hastings," he said softly. "The note Clara found, 'Midnight, quarry, come alone,' was not meant for Crane." Map. His finger tracing paths to the quarry and the yew tree. He sent Hastings to verify the servants' accounts, ensuring no one had left the house unnoticed the previous night. The butler, Perkins, confirmed that all doors and windows had been locked as instructed, and the maids reported no unusual sounds before the scream. Yet Holmes' attention lingered on the quarry, where he returned with Hastings at noon, the clay-heavy ground still damp from recent rain. "This quarry," Holmes said, kneeling to examine the soil,
is the key to the mud in the library. Someone was here, perhaps to stage the carriage or to plant the button. But why? To create a myth or to hide a truth? He rose, his eyes scanning the horizon. The carriage is a fiction, Hastings, but the mud is real. It was carried into the house deliberately, perhaps on a shoe, perhaps in a cloth. The killer is clever, but not clever enough. Back at the hall, Holmes requested to see Grayson's medical journal, which the doctor produced with visible reluctance. The book was indeed in his room, its pages marked with a faint trace of blue ink. "As you claimed, Doctor," Holmes said, his tone neutral. "But this ink, it matches the smudge on the will. Did you handle Crane's papers that night?" Grayson shook his head vehemently. "No, I took the journal and left. I swear it." Holmes nodded, dismissing him, but his eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "He is nervous, Hastings. The trap is working." As evening approached, Holmes orchestrated the scene with meticulous care. He instructed the household to dress as they had on the night of the murder, to recreate the atmosphere of tension. The library was prepared, windows closed, curtains drawn, the desk arranged with Crane's papers, though the body was, of course, absent. Holmes placed a single candle on the desk, its light casting eerie shadows. He positioned himself near the door, with Hastings and Japp stationed in the corridor, hidden but watchful. At 9 p.m., the household filed into the library, their faces a mix of apprehension and curiosity. Holmes stood before them, his voice low but commanding. "On the night of the murder," he began, "Mr. Crane was here working on a will that threatened someone's future. The killer entered unseen and struck with a letter opener. The window was opened to suggest an intruder, the mud planted to mislead. But the killer made a mistake, a small one but fatal." He paced, his eyes scanning each face. "Let us imagine the scene. The clock strikes 1:30 a.m. Dr. Grayson enters, takes a book, and leaves. Crane is alive. At 2:13 a.m., a scream is heard. In that interval, the killer acted. Who was it?" He paused through the paddock. He relit the candle, revealing the group frozen in place, their eyes wide. "Fear reveals much," Holmes said, his gaze piercing. "The killer expected darkness, expected chaos. But I see you all clearly." He turned to the desk, picking up a pen, the same blue-inked fountain pen from the servants' quarters. "This pen," he said, "left the smudge on the will. It was handled by someone who knew Crane's plans, someone who stood to lose. And the button, its symbol, a crescent moon and thorn, links to Silas Thorne, the creditor. But is Thorne real, or a fiction created to distract?" Julian Marlowe shifted, his hands clenching. "You're accusing me, aren't you?" he snapped. "I wasn't here, I was in my room." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Your anger, Monsieur Julian, is telling. But let us test another theory." He turned to Grayson. "Doctor, your boots carried mud from the quarry, yet you claim no knowledge of it. A lie, perhaps?" Grayson stammered. "I told you I walk the grounds." "Enough," Holmes said, his voice sharp. He turned to Clara. "Mademoiselle, the note you found, why was it behind Jane Eyre? Did you place it there?" Clara's eyes widened. "No, I found it as I said." Holmes nodded, stepping back. "The trap is set," he said softly. "The killer is here, and they are uneasy. Tonight, They will act to protect their secret. We will be ready. As the group dispersed, their faces pale, Holmes whispered to Hastings, "The pressure is working, my friend. The killer is cornered, and they will make a mistake. Stay vigilant." The clock struck 10 p.m., and the house settled into an uneasy quiet. Hastings, stationed in the corridor, felt the weight of the night, knowing that Holmes's trap was about to close. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the faint echo of hooves, a sound that might have been the Phantom Carriage or merely the beating of his own heart. The reveal. The library of Blackthorn Hall, bathed in the flickering light of a single candle, was a stage set for the denouement of a grim drama. At precisely 9:47 p.m., as the mantel clock's chimes reverberated through the tense air, Sherlock Holmes stood before the assembled household, his small, immaculate figure radiating an authority that silenced even the restless wind outside. Captain Arthur Hastings, positioned near the door, felt his pulse quicken, sensing that the moment of truth had arrived. Maintained her regal composure, though her lips were pressed thin. Colonel Ashford, his military bearing eroded by days of strain, gripped the arm of his chair, his gaze fixed on Holmes. "Mesdames et messieurs," Holmes began, his voice calm but resonant. "We have reached the heart of this mystery. A man is dead, struck down in this very room, and the killer sits among us. The Phantom Carriage, the button, the mud, the will, these were not random, but threads in a tapestry of deception. Tonight I, Sherlock Holmes, will weave them into the truth." He paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes scanning each face. "Let us reconstruct the night of the murder, step by step, using the little grey cells to see what others overlook." At 1:30 a.m., Dr. Grayson entered this library, took a medical journal, and left, leaving Mr. Crane alive at his desk. At 2:13 a.m., a scream was heard and Crane was found dead, stabbed with a letter opener. The window was open, yet no tracks marred the dew outside. A smear of clay mud lay on the rug, and a will, smudged with blue ink, was crumpled near the body. These are the facts. Holmes paused, letting the silence build. But facts alone are not enough. We must consider motive, means, and opportunity. The will, which redistributed the Ashford estate, threatened someone's future. The mud from the quarry suggested an outsider, yet no one entered or left. The button, with its crescent moon and thorn, pointed to a mysterious Silas Thorne, and the Phantom Carriage, a fiction designed to sow fear and confusion. He turned to the desk, lifting the letter opener, its silver handle gleaming. This weapon was taken from the desk, an act of opportunity, not premeditation. The killer acted swiftly, in a moment of rage or desperation, but they were clever, planting the mud, opening the window, creating the myth of the carriage to divert suspicion. Holmes' gaze settled on Julian Marlowe. "Monsieur Julian, you overheard Mr. Crane discussing the will, suggesting you might be cut out entirely. Your anger was palpable. Your cigarette case bore traces of blue ink, matching the smudge on the will. Did you confront Crane that night?" Julian's face reddened, his hands clenching. "I told you, I was in my room. I didn't touch him." Holmes nodded, unmoved, and turned to Clara. "Mademoiselle Clara, Crane's improper advances troubled you. You found a note, midnight, quarry, come alone, behind Jane Eyre. A note meant for someone else, perhaps, but you kept it secret until yesterday. Why?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I was afraid," she whispered. "I thought it might make me look guilty." Holmes' expression softened, but he pressed on, turning to Dr. Grayson. "Doctor, you were in the library at 1:30 a.m., yet you omitted this until pressed." Voice cracked. "No! I swear I left him alive!" Holmes raised a hand, silencing the room. "Enough! The truth lies not in denials, but in the details. The blue ink, the mud, the button, they point to one person, a mind that planned, yet faltered under pressure. He turned to Lady Beatrice Marlowe, his eyes piercing. "Madam, you have been the picture of composure, yet your hand trembles when you speak of Crane. You knew of the will's changes, which threatened your son's inheritance. You handled legal matters with Crane, yet you concealed a meeting with him the night before his death. And the button, its symbol, a crescent moon and thorn, matches an old brooch in your possession, one you wore at dinner 2 nights ago." Lady Beatrice's composure cracked, her face paling.
"That is absurd, Monsieur Holmes. A brooch is not a button, and I was asleep when Crane was killed."
Holmes produced the button, holding it beside a sketch from Crane's notebook, the same crescent moon and thorn. "This symbol is no coincidence, madam. It is yours, a relic of your late husband's family, linked to a debt owed to Silas Thorne, a man who does not exist. You created him, a fiction to mask your actions." The room gasped, and Julian leapt to his feet. "Mother, tell him it's not true." Lady Beatrice's lips trembled, but she remained silent. Holmes continued, his voice relentless. "You went to the quarry, madam, to gather clay, which you planted in the library to suggest an intruder. You opened the window, knowing the dew would show no tracks. You wrote the note to lure Crane to the library, but when he refused, you acted. You took the letter opener, driven by fear that the will would ruin your son's future. The scream was yours, a moment of panic after the deed." Lady Beatrice rose, her eyes blazing. "You have no proof, Holmes. This is conjecture." Holmes's smile was cold. "The proof is in the ink, madam. The smudge on the will matches the blue ink in your room, found in a pen you used to draft a letter to Crane. The mud on your slippers, hidden in your wardrobe, matches the quarry clay. And the button, you dropped it deliberately, a miscalculation, thinking it would point to a phantom." Lady Beatrice swayed, her hand clutching the back of a chair. I only wanted to protect Julian," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Crane was going to ruin us, to take everything. I didn't mean to kill him. He laughed at me, mocked me. I lost control." The room erupted in chaos. Julian's anguished cry, Clara's sob, the Colonel's stunned silence. Japp stepped forward, his handcuffs ready, but Holmes raised a hand. "Inspector, take her gently. The confession is enough." As Lady Beatrice was led away, her head bowed, Holmes turned to Hastings. "The little grey cells, my friend, see what others may."
Dispersed, shaken to their core, Holmes stood by the window gazing into the night. "A tragedy, Hastings," he said softly. "Greed and fear, masked by a phantom. But the truth always emerges." Outside the wind carried no sound of hooves, only the quiet of a mystery solved. Chapter 11. The Reflection. The morning after Lady Beatrice Marlowe's confession cast a sombre pall over Blackthorn Hall, as if the very stones exhaled a sigh of relief mingled with sorrow. At 9:23 a.m., as the drawing-room clock ticked with its steady rhythm, the household gathered one final time, their faces etched with a mix of shock, guilt, and quiet resignation. Captain Arthur Hastings stood by the window, the weak October sunlight filtering through the last wisps of fog, his mind still reeling from the dramatic unmasking of the previous night. Sherlock Holmes, seated in a high-backed chair, his hands folded neatly in his lap, exuded an air of serene finality, his sharp eyes softened by a rare moment of introspection. Inspector Japp, now bustling with the efficiency of a man whose case was closed, was overseeing the formalities of Lady Beatrice's detention. She had been taken to a guest room under guard, awaiting transport to Thornwick for further questioning. The rest of the household,
Colonel Ashford, Clara, Julian, and Dr. Grayson sat in silence, each grappling with the truth that had shattered their fragile equilibrium. Holmes rose, his small frame commanding the room with effortless authority. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, his voice calm but resonant. "The mystery of Mr. Victor Crane's death has been resolved, but the story is not yet complete. A crime, however heinous, is but a symptom of deeper truths, truths about the human heart, its desires, its fears. Allow me, Sherlock Holmes, to reflect on what we have learned." He paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes distant yet piercing. This case began with a phantom, a carriage that haunted the night, leaving no tracks, conjuring fear. It was a clever ruse, designed by Lady Beatrice to divert suspicion from her actions. The button, with its crescent moon and thorn, was no mere accident, but a deliberate misdirection, drawn from her own past, a symbol tied to her late husband's family. The mud from the quarry, the open window, the note hidden behind Jane Eyre, all were threads in a tapestry of deception, woven to protect her son's future. He paused, his gaze settling on Julian, who sat hunched, his face pale. "Monsieur Julian, your mother acted out of love, however misguided."
Crucial. The letter from Crane, his improper advances, revealed a man whose greed overreached his judgment. You were right to fear him, but your silence nearly cost you dearly. Clara nodded, her voice barely audible. "I should have spoken sooner, Monsieur Holmes. I was ashamed." "There is no shame in truth," Holmes said gently, then addressed Dr. Grayson. "Doctor, your omission of being in the library was a mistake, but an understandable one. Fear clouds judgment, but your honesty, when pressed, aided us." Grayson adjusted his spectacles, his face ashen. "I only wish I'd been braver," he murmured. Finally, Holmes faced Colonel Ashford. "Colonel, your debts to the fictional Silas Thorne were the spark that ignited this tragedy. Your secrecy, though born of pride, allowed Crane to manipulate and Lady Beatrice to act. Honesty, even when painful, is the better path." The colonel bowed his head, his voice hoarse. "I failed this family, Holmes. If I'd been open about the debts—" Holmes raised a hand, silencing him. "Regret changes nothing, Colonel. Learn from it and rebuild." He stepped to the center of the room, his voice taking on a philosophical tone. "In every case, I seek not only the who and the how, but the why. Why does a woman of grace and dignity turn to murder? Why does a house of wealth and tradition harbor such secrets? It is because the human heart is a labyrinth, full of shadows and desires. My method, the method of Sherlock Holmes, is to navigate that labyrinth with logic, to shine a light on the shadows with the little grey cells. No detail is too small, no contradiction too trivial. The truth is always there, waiting to be seen." Hastings, watching his friend, felt a pang of admiration. Holmes's words were not merely a summation, but a manifesto, a glimpse into the mind that had solved countless puzzles with unerring precision. Yet there was a sadness in his tone, a recognition of the cost of truth. Holmes turned to Japp, who was scribbling furiously. "Inspector, you doubted my methods, but you see now their necessity. The red herrings, the carriage, the open window were meant to mislead you. But the truth lies in the ink, the mud, the button, and the heart of a mother who lost her way." Japp nodded grudgingly,
You've got a way about you, Holmes. I'll give you that. But we'll need a full statement for the record. Of course, Holmes said, his smile faint. I leave the paperwork to you, Inspector. He turned to Hastings, his voice lowering. My friend, you have been invaluable.
Holmes, thank you. I don't know how we'll go on, but you've given us clarity.
Holmes bowed slightly. Clarity is my gift, mademoiselle. Use it to heal. The colonel rose, his face resolute. I'll settle the debts, Holmes. No more secrets. Clara deserves better. Holmes nodded, then gathered his valise, signaling his intent to depart. Our work here is done, Hastings. The train to London awaits, and there are other puzzles to solve. As they stepped into the crisp morning air, the grounds of Blackthorn Hall seemed less foreboding. The yew tree no longer a spectre of mystery, but merely a tree. The carriage that had haunted the night was revealed as a myth, its echoes silenced by the truth. Holmes paused, gazing at the estate one last time. Every case, Hastings, he said softly, is a lesson in humanity. We solve the crime, but the heart remains a mystery. That is why I, Sherlock Holmes, will never cease to seek. They boarded the hired carriage, the driver tipping his hat, and as Blackthorn Hall receded into the distance, Hastings felt a quiet awe. Holmes had not only solved a murder, but had laid bare the frailties and fears of those involved, leaving them to rebuild in the light of truth. The journey back to London was quiet, Holmes lost in thought, his eyes fixed on the passing countryside. Hastings, too, was silent, reflecting on the case and the man who, with his little grey cells, had once again brought order to chaos. Chapter 12. The Unseen Shadow. The departure of Sherlock Holmes and Captain Arthur Hastings from Blackthorn Hall had left a void in the grand estate, as if the resolution of Victor Crane's murder had drained the air of its electric tension, only to replace it with a heavy, lingering unease. It was now the 5th day, 10:15 a.m. on October 27th, as the drawing-room clock ticked with its relentless rhythm, and the household found itself grappling with the aftermath of Lady Beatrice Marlowe's confession. Yet, as Hastings prepared to board the train back to London, a nagging doubt gnawed at him, a sense that the puzzle, though seemingly complete, lacked one final piece. Holmes, ever perceptive, noticed his friend's disquiet as they stood on the platform at Thornwick Station, the morning mist curling around their feet. "You are troubled, Hastings," he said, his sharp eyes studying his companion. "The little grey cells, they whisper to you, do they not?" Hastings adjusted his scarf, his breath visible in the chill air. It feels too neat, Holmes. Lady Beatrice's confession, the ink, the mud, the button. It all fits, but something feels off. Why the carriage? Why the elaborate ruse if she acted in a moment of passion? Holmes's lips curved into a faint smile, his gaze distant. "An excellent observation, my friend. The mind of Sherlock Holmes is never at rest until every thread is accounted for. The carriage—"
Murder itself, yet it was staged with care. Let us return to the hall. There is work yet to be done. They hired a carriage and retraced their steps to Blackthorn Hall, arriving just before noon. The household, still reeling from the previous night's revelation, greeted their return with a mix of surprise and apprehension. Colonel Ashford, his face drawn, met them in the entrance hall. "Holmes, Hastings, what brings you back? I thought the case was closed." "Not quite, Colonel," Holmes replied, his tone measured. "There is a shadow yet unseen, a detail that eludes us. I require your permission to search the grounds once more and to speak with your groundskeeper, old Tom, again." The Colonel nodded, his eyes weary. "Do what you must. This house has seen enough secrets." Holmes led Hastings to the stables, where old Tom was polishing a harness, his weathered hand steady, but his expression wary. "Monsieur Tom," Holmes said, his voice courteous but firm, "you spoke of the Phantom Carriage, black, silent, drawn by 2 horses. I need you to recall every detail. Was there anything unusual about the horses, the wheels,
The sound. Tom scratched his jaw, his eyes narrowing. It was dark, sir, and the fog was thick. But, now you mention it, the wheels didn't creak like a proper carriage. They were quiet, like they was padded or wrapped. And the horses, they moved too smooth, almost like they wasn't touching the ground. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Padded wheels, you say? Most interesting. And the cloaked figure, did he move, gesture, anything at all? Tom hesitated, then said, "He raised a hand, sir, like he was signalling, but not to me, to someone in the house, maybe. I couldn't see clear." Holmes thanked him and led Hastings to the yew tree where the button had been found. He knelt, his magnifying glass tracing the ground once more. "No tracks, as before," he murmured. "But padded wheels, a carriage designed to leave no trace. This was no phantom, Hastings, but a machine of human design, crafted to deceive." They moved to the quarry, where Holmes examined the clay soil with renewed intensity. He scooped a sample, noting its consistency, then pointed to a faint indentation near the edge, a rectangular mark, partially obscured by grass. "A wheel, Hastings," he said. "Not a hoof print, but a wheel, pressed lightly. Someone brought a carriage here, or a cart, and took pains to conceal it." Back at the hall, Holmes requested to see the outbuildings, particularly the old coach house, which stood neglected behind the stables. The Colonel, Clara, and Dr. Grayson accompanied them, while Julian remained in his room, still shaken by his mother's confession. The coach house was dusty, its doors creaking as they opened to reveal a collection of outdated vehicles, a phaeton, a gig, and, in the corner, a small black cart, its wheels wrapped in strips of cloth. Holmes examined the cart, his fingers tracing the cloth. "Padded wheels," he said softly. "And look, Hastings, a trace of clay on the axle. This is our Phantom Carriage, used to stage the nightly apparitions." Clara gasped. "But who would do this? Lady Beatrice admitted to the murder." Holmes' expression was grim. "She admitted to the act, mademoiselle, but not to the carriage. The carriage was another's work, designed to create fear and distract from the true crime. Someone else in this house had a hand in this affair, perhaps not in the murder, but in its concealment." He turned to the Colonel. "Your debts to Silas Thorne, who knew of them, besides Crane and Lady Beatrice?" The Colonel frowned, his voice low. "Only my steward, Perkins. He handled the correspondence, kept the books." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "Perkins, the butler, a man of quiet efficiency, always present, yet unnoticed. Where is he now?" Dr. Grayson spoke up, his voice hesitant. "He was in the kitchen this morning, preparing tea, but I haven't seen him since." Holmes moved swiftly, leading the group back to the house. They found Perkins in the servants' quarters, packing a small bag, his face pale as he saw Holmes. "Monsieur Perkins," Holmes said, his voice like steel, "you were about to leave us, I see. Care to explain the cart in the coach house?" Perkins froze, his hands trembling. I don't know what you mean, sir." Holmes stepped closer, his gaze unrelenting. "You do, monsieur. The cart, its wheels padded to leave no tracks, was used to stage the Phantom Carriage. The button, with its crescent moon and thorn, was yours. A keepsake, from an old debt, perhaps, linked to the fictional Silas Thorne. You knew of the Colonel's troubles, and you saw an opportunity to sow chaos, to protect your own interests." Perkins' shoulders slumped, his voice barely audible. "I didn't kill Crane, I swear it. But I knew he was trouble. He was pushing the Colonel to sell the estate to settle the debts. I've served here all my life. I couldn't let it go. I used the cart to scare the household, to make them think it was cursed, hoping they'd leave. The button, I dropped it to add to the mystery." Holmes nodded, his expression stern but not unkind. "You played a dangerous game, Perkins. Your actions muddied the truth, but they did not kill. That was Lady Beatrice's doing." Inspector Japp, who had joined them, stepped forward. "You're under arrest, Perkins, for obstructing justice. We'll sort out the rest in Thornwick." "Gratitude." The colonel, his face ashen, murmured, "I trusted him." Holmes placed a hand on his shoulder. "Trust is a fragile thing, Colonel. Rebuild it with care." As they prepared to leave once more, Holmes gazed at the yew tree, its branches swaying in the breeze. "Every puzzle has its shadows, Hastings," he said softly, "but the little grey cells see through them all." The carriage to Thornwick awaited, and as Blackthorn Hall faded into the mist, Hastings felt a sense of closure, tempered by the knowledge that some wounds would take time to heal. Chapter 13. The Echoes of Truth. The afternoon sun hung low over Blackthorn Hall, casting long shadows across the Sussex Downs as Captain Arthur Hastings and Sherlock Holmes prepared to depart for the second time. It was 2:14 p.m. on October 27th, and the air carried a crisp bite, as if the estate itself were exhaling the last of its secrets. The revelation of Perkins's role in staging the Phantom Carriage had added a final, unexpected layer to the mystery of Victor Crane's murder. Yet it left the household in a state of quiet disarray, each member grappling with the consequences of truth laid bare. Holmes, standing by the hired carriage, adjusted his gloves with his characteristic precision, his sharp eyes scanning the grounds one last time. Hastings, beside him, felt a mix of relief and lingering unease. The case was solved. Lady Beatrice Marlowe's confession to the murder and Perkins' admission to orchestrating the ghostly carriage had tied up the loose ends, but the human cost weighed heavily. The colonel's trust in his steward was shattered, Clara's innocence was shadowed by her silence, and Julian faced a future without his mother's guiding hand. As they awaited the driver, Colonel Ashford emerged from the hall, his face etched with a weary resolve. "Monsieur Holmes, Captain Hastings," he said, his voice hoarse but steady, "I owe you more than I can express. You've saved this family from further ruin, though the scars will remain." Holmes bowed slightly, his expression composed but not unkind. "The truth, Colonel, is a sharp blade, but it cuts cleanly. You have the chance now to rebuild, to make Blackthorn Hall a place of light rather than a shadow." The colonel nodded, his eyes glistening. "I'll sell what I must to clear the debts. Clara will have her future, and Julian, I'll do right by him, for Beatrice's sake." Clara appeared at the door, her pale face softened by a tentative smile. "Monsieur Holmes," she said, stepping forward, "I was afraid to speak, but you saw what I could not. Thank you." Holmes's gaze softened. "Mademoiselle Clara, courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. You found that courage in the end." Julian lingered in the background, his expression a mix of grief and defiance. He said nothing. Lionel Grayson, standing nearby, adjusted his spectacles nervously. I'll stay on for a time," he said. "The colonel needs a physician, and I owe it to him to make amends for my silence." Holmes nodded approvingly. "A wise choice, Doctor. Honesty, even belated, is a step toward redemption." Inspector Japp approached, his notebook tucked under his arm, his usual bluster subdued. "Well, Holmes," he said, "you've done it again. I'll admit, I thought it was a vagrant at first, but you saw through the lot. I'll see to it that Lady Beatrice and Perkins face justice in Thornwick." Holmes's lips curved faintly. "Justice, Inspector, is your domain. I seek only the truth, but do ensure the paperwork is precise. Sherlock Holmes does not tolerate sloppy records." Japp chuckled, a rare sound, and tipped his hat. Fair enough, Holmes. Safe travels. As the carriage rolled away from Blackthorn Hall, Hastings leaned back, watching the estate recede into the mist. It's a remarkable thing, Holmes, he said, how you see what others miss. The carriage, the button, the ink, it all seems so tangled, yet you unraveled it with such clarity. Holmes gazed out the window, his expression pensive. The world, Hastings, is a tapestry of details, each thread a clue to the human soul. The Phantom Carriage was a distraction, but it revealed Perkins's fear of losing his home. The button, a misstep by Lady Beatrice, betrayed her desperation to protect her son. The ink and mud were the fingerprints of intent, pointing to a crime born of panic and pride. My method is simple: observe, deduce, and never assume. Hastings nodded, his mind replaying the case. But the carriage, why such an elaborate ruse? Perkins could have spread rumors without it. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Fear, my friend, is a powerful weapon. Perkins knew the household was superstitious, prone to tales of curses. The carriage, silent and ghostly, amplified their dread, making them less likely to question the murder's true cause. It was a clever ploy, though not clever enough to escape the little grey cells. The train to London awaited at Thornwick Station, its whistle cutting through the quiet countryside. As they boarded, Holmes settled into his seat, his valise at his side, and opened a small notebook, jotting down observations. Every case, Hastings, he said, his voice low, is a mirror to the human condition. Lady Beatrice acted for love, Perkins for loyalty, yet both strayed into darkness. It is a reminder that even the best intentions can lead to ruin. Hastings frowned, struck by the weight of Holmes's words. Do you ever tire of it, Holmes? Peering into those shadows, seeing the worst in people. Holmes's smile was faint, almost wistful. The shadows are where the truth hides, Hastings.
That is enough.
The train rattled through the Sussex valleys, the fog lifting to reveal patches of green and gold. Hastings leaned back, his thoughts drifting to Blackthorn Hall and its fractured family. The case was closed, the killer and her accomplice unmasked. But the echoes of their actions would linger. He glanced at Holmes, who was now reading a newspaper, his face serene, as if the weight of the case had already lifted. Another puzzle solved. Hastings said softly, almost to himself. Holmes looked up, his eyes twinkling. And another awaits, my friend. The world is never short of mysteries for Sherlock Holmes. As the train carried them toward London, the shadows of Blackthorn Hall faded, but the lessons of the case, its truths, its tragedies, remained etched in Hastings' mind, a testament to the brilliance of the man beside him. Chapter 14. The Lingering Doubt. The train to London rattled through the Sussex countryside, its steady rhythm a counterpoint to the quiet intensity of Sherlock Holmes, who sat opposite Captain Arthur Hastings, his small, immaculate figure framed by the window's fading light. It was 3:22 p.m. on October the 27th, and the rolling hills, now bathed in the golden hues of late afternoon, seemed to carry a deceptive calm. Hastings, though relieved by the resolution of the Blackthorn Hall mystery, felt a persistent unease, a faint whisper in his mind that the case, though closed, held one final secret, a doubt that refused to be silenced. Holmes, ever attuned to his friend's moods, lowered the newspaper he had been perusing and fixed Hastings with a piercing gaze. "You are restless, Hastings," he said, his voice soft but incisive. "The little grey cells, they murmur to you, do they not? What troubles you now, when the murderer and her accomplice have been unmasked. Hastings shifted in his seat, his hands fidgeting with his hat. "It's just something doesn't sit right, Holmes. Lady Beatrice's confession was complete, and Perkins's role in the carriage ruse explained the ghostly tales. But the note Clara found, midnight, quarry, come alone, it feels misplaced. Why was it behind Jane Eyre, and why was it written in blue ink, like the smudge on the will, yet not in Lady Beatrice's hand?" Holmes's eyes gleamed, a spark of approval in their depths. "An excellent question, my friend. You begin to see as I do, to notice the threads that do not align. The note, indeed, is an anomaly. It was not meant for Crane, nor was it written by Lady Beatrice. Let us consider its purpose."
Porter, and secured a carriage back to Blackthorn Hall, arriving as dusk settled over the estate at 6:08 p.m. The house loomed against the twilight, its windows glowing faintly, and the air carried a chill that seemed to echo the unresolved tension within. Colonel Ashford met them at the door, his face a mask of surprise and fatigue.
"Holmes, Hastings, what brings you back again? I thought all was settled."
"Not quite, Colonel," Holmes replied, his tone brisk. "A small matter remains, a detail that eludes us. I must speak with Mademoiselle Clara and examine the library once more." Clara was summoned, her pale face betraying her exhaustion. She stood in the entrance hall, her shawl drawn tightly around her.
"Monsieur Holmes," she said, her voice trembling, "is something wrong? I thought it was over."
Holmes' expression was gentle but probing. "Mademoiselle, the note you found behind Jane Eyre. You said you discovered it after lunch, yes? Can you recall exactly where it was placed?" Clara nodded, leading them to the library. The room was as they had left it, the desk still strewn with Crane's papers, though the blood-stained rug had been removed. She pointed to a bookshelf near the window.
"It was here, tucked behind the book, on the second shelf. I only noticed it because the book was slightly askew."
Holmes examined the shelf, his magnifying glass tracing the edges of Jane Eyre. "No dust disturbed," he murmured. "The book was moved recently, within the last day or two. The note was placed deliberately, not dropped by accident." He turned to Clara, his eyes narrowing. "Mademoiselle, you were troubled by Crane's advances, yet you kept his letter hidden in this very book. Why return to the library to find another note unless you suspected something more?" Clara's eyes widened, her hands twisting her shawl.
I wasn't sure. After all that happened, I thought there might be something else, something I'd missed. I didn't expect to find that note."
Holmes nodded, his gaze shifting to the desk. He picked up the fountain pen, its blue ink matching the smudge on the will and the note Clara had found. "This pen," he said, "is the key. It was used to write the note, but not by Lady Beatrice, whose pen in her room was black, nor by Perkins, whose hands were clean of ink. Someone else wrote this note, someone who wished to manipulate the events of that night." He turned to the Colonel. "Colonel, your steward, Perkins, confessed to staging the carriage, but he denied knowledge of the note. Who else had access to the servants' quarters, where this blue ink was kept?" The Colonel frowned, his voice hesitant. "The servants, of course, but Clara helps with the household accounts sometimes. She's been in there, though rarely. Clara, but of knowledge."
"You found the note, yet you delayed telling me until the trap was set. Why?" Clara's voice broke, tears spilling over. "I was afraid. I thought it might implicate someone else, someone I cared about. I didn't write it, I swear." Holmes's gaze softened, but his voice remained firm. "Then who, mademoiselle?" The note was a lure meant to draw someone to the quarry, perhaps to witness the carriage or to create an alibi. Who else in this house had reason to manipulate Crane? The answer came not from Clara, but from a figure in the doorway, Dr. Lionel Grayson, his spectacles glinting in the candlelight. "It was me," he said, his voice steady but strained. "I wrote the note." The room fell silent, the air thick with shock. Holmes turned, his expression unreadable. "Doctor, explain yourself." Grayson stepped forward, his hands trembling. "Crane was ruining the Colonel's estate, pushing him to sell to settle debts I knew were fabricated. I'd seen the letters from this so-called Silas Thorne. They were in Crane's handwriting, a scheme to pressure the Colonel. I wrote the note to lure Crane to the quarry, to confront him away from the house, but he never went. I didn't kill him. I was in my room when the scream came, but I wanted him exposed." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And the ink? The note was written with the same blue ink as the smudge on the will?" Grayson nodded, his face ashen. "I handled the will earlier that day, checking it for the Colonel. I must have left the smudge. I didn't realize it would matter." Holmes paced, his mind clearly racing. "Your intent was noble, Doctor, but your silence was costly. The note placed behind Jane Eyre was meant to be found to sow confusion. You did not kill Crane, but you gave Lady Beatrice the opportunity to act, believing her son's future was at stake." Grayson sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "I only wanted to protect the Colonel, this house." Holmes turned to Clara. "And you, mademoiselle, found the note and kept it secret, fearing it pointed to Dr. Grayson. Your loyalty is commendable but dangerous." Clara sobbed, nodding. I thought he might be blamed." Holmes's expression softened. "The truth, though painful, is always the better path." He addressed the Colonel. "This house is free of its shadows now, Colonel. Dr. Grayson's actions, though misguided, were not criminal. Let him stay and make amends." The Colonel nodded, his voice gruff. "I will, Holmes. We've all made mistakes." As Holmes and Hastings prepared to leave once more, the detective paused at the door, his gaze lingering on the
Laid bare.
Chapter 15. The Final Departure. The evening of October 27th settled over Blackthorn Hall, with a quiet that felt almost sacred, as if the estate, purged of its secrets, could finally breathe. At 7:12 p.m., as the last light of day faded into a twilight glow, Captain Arthur Hastings stood in the entrance hall, his suitcase packed, his heart heavy with the weight of the case's resolution. The unmasking of Lady Beatrice Marlowe as Victor Crane's killer, Perkins's confession to staging the Phantom Carriage, and Dr. Lionel Grayson's admission to writing the cryptic note had brought clarity, but at a cost. The household, though freed from the shadow of murder, faced a future marked by loss and rebuilding. Sherlock Holmes, his small, immaculate figure framed by the great oak door, adjusted his hat with a precision that belied the emotional undercurrents of the moment. His sharp eyes, usually so piercing, held a rare softness as he surveyed the hall one final time. Colonel Ashford, Clara, and Dr. Grayson stood to bid them farewell, their faces a mix of gratitude and sorrow. Julian Marlowe remained absent, secluded in his room, grappling with his mother's actions. Inspector Japp had departed earlier, escorting Lady Beatrice and Perkins to Thornwick for formal proceedings, his gruff satisfaction tempered by an acknowledgment of Holmes's brilliance. "Monsieur Holmes, Captain Hastings," the colonel said, his voice steady but strained. "Words cannot convey my gratitude. You've saved this house from ruin, though the scars will take time to heal. Holmes bowed slightly, his expression composed. The scars, Colonel, are the price of truth. But they will fade, and Blackthorn Hall will stand stronger for it. Trust in Mademoiselle Clara and Dr. Grayson to guide you forward. Clara stepped forward, her pale face softened by a tentative smile. Monsieur Holmes, I was afraid to speak, but you saw what I could not. You've given us a chance to start anew. I'll never forget it. Holmes's gaze warmed, a rare flicker of emotion crossing his features. Mademoiselle, your courage, though delayed, was the key to unlocking the truth. Use it wisely in the days ahead. Dr. Grayson, his spectacles glinting in the lamplight, cleared his throat. I made mistakes, Holmes, but I'll stay and make amends. The Colonel needs me, and I owe him that much. Holmes nodded approvingly. Redemption, Doctor, lies in action, not words. You have chosen well. The Colonel extended his hand, his grip firm despite his weariness. I'll clear the debts, Holmes, and be open with Clara and Julian. No more secret
Deceptions. Lady Beatrice's desperate act to protect her son, Perkins' misguided loyalty in staging the carriage, Grayson's attempt to expose Crane's schemes. Each had played a part in the tragedy, and Holmes had unraveled it with his unerring logic. The carriage rolled through the darkening lanes, the silhouette of Blackthorn Hall fading into the mist. Hastings leaned back, his thoughts drifting to the clues that had led them here, the blue ink smudge, the quarry mud, the crescent moon button, the note behind Jane Eyre. Holmes, he said, breaking the silence. This case was different. It wasn't just about the murder, was it? It was about the people, their fears, their loyalties. Holmes, gazing out at the passing countryside, nodded slowly. Every case, Hastings, is a study in humanity. The little grey cells, they see the clues, the ink, the mud, the button, but they also see the heart. Lady Beatrice acted out of love, Perkins out of loyalty, Grayson out of duty. Their errors were grave, but their motives were human. That is what makes a puzzle worth solving. Hastings frowned, struck by the depth of Holmes's insight. Do you ever wonder, Holmes, if there's a case that will elude even you? Holmes's smile was faint, almost wistful. The world is vast, Hastings, and the human heart vaster still. There may come a puzzle that challenges even Sherlock Holmes, but I will meet it with order, with method, with the little grey cells. Until then, I seek the truth, and that is enough. The train whistle sounded as they reached Thornwick Station, its mournful note echoing through the quiet evening. They boarded, settling into their compartment, the clatter of the rails a soothing counterpoint to the intensity of the past days. Holmes opened his notebook, jotting down final observations, his face serene. Hastings watched him, marveling at the man who could navigate the darkest corners of human nature and emerge with clarity. As the train sped toward London, the lights of the city glimmering in the distance, Hastings felt a sense of closure. Blackthorn Hall, with its phantom carriage and hidden truths, was behind them, but its lessons lingered, a reminder that even in the face of deception, the truth could be found, if one looked with the precision and patience of Sherlock Holmes. Another case closed, Hastings said softly, almost to himself.
Holmes looked up, his eyes twinkling. "And another awaits, my friend. The world is never short of mysteries, and Sherlock Holmes is never short of answers."